When Die Another Day went into production, the filmmakers were trying to create a Bond movie that felt bigger, faster, and more spectacular than anything that had come before it. That meant taking the production from the frozen landscapes of Iceland to the enormous waves of Hawaii, while also constructing one of the largest practical sets in history of the Bond series. But what makes these sequences fascinating isn't just what appears on screen. It's how the filmmakers combine real locations, stunt performers, modified vehicles, practical effects, and more to create them. So today, we're going behind the scenes of Die Another Day. Die Another Day throws the audience straight into the middle of a military operation. James Bond has infiltrated North Korea's demilitarized zone, but after his identity is exposed, the situation quickly explodes into chaos. Soldiers open fire, vehicles are destroyed, explosions tear through the base, and Bond finds himself racing across a mine-filled battlefield in a hovercraft. But despite looking like it was filmed in North Korea, most of this sequence was actually created in England. The production used several locations, including the Army's tank-driving grounds at Aldershot, the Pinewood Studios backlot, and the abandoned Chinnor Cement Works in Oxfordshire. Together, these locations were transformed into a convincing Korean battlefield. The enormous action sequence was largely handled by legendary Bond stunt coordinator and second unit director Vic Armstrong, working alongside cinematographer Jonathan Taylor and aerial coordinator Mike Woodley. One of the first major explosions occurs when Colonel Moon realizes that Bond is actually a British agent. Moon uses his powerful anti-tank weapon to destroy the helicopter Bond arrived in. The explosion was created as a practical effect rather than simply being generated digitally, allowing the filmmakers to capture a real fireball and debris for the camera. The production's extensive use of practical destruction was one of the defining characteristics of this opening sequence. Then comes the centerpiece, the hovercraft chase. Interestingly, the filmmakers didn't originally plan to use hovercrafts at all. They had considered using enormous Caspian Sea skimmers, also known as achronoplanes. But aerial coordinator Mike Woodley pointed out a major problem. Those enormous vehicles need a huge amount of space to turn. A hovercraft, on the other hand, can practically spin around its own axis. That made it much more useful for the fast, aggressive chase the filmmakers wanted, so the production brought in real Griffin 2000 TD hovercrafts and sent them into one of the most unusual stunt environments imaginable, a muddy military testing ground. And controlling them on land was much harder than expected. Hovercrafts work beautifully on water and ice, but on uneven land, they become extremely difficult to control. The stunt drivers quickly discovered that the vehicles could skid, slide, and behave unpredictably because they were riding on a cushion of air rather than gripping the ground like normal vehicles. The production initially arranged 2 large mothercraft vehicles and 4 smaller hovercrafts, but the constant crashes and heavy stunt work quickly destroyed their supply. By the end of production, 18 hovercrafts had been destroyed, forcing the crew to establish an in-house production line just to repair and rebuild vehicles fast enough to keep filming. And getting the camera into the middle of all this chaos was another challenge. Cinematographer Jonathan Taylor mounted a camera onto a Toyota ATV, which could chase the hovercrafts across the muddy terrain. The camera was fitted with a Stab-C gyro-stabilized mount, which compensated for the ATV bouncing, skidding, and shaking across the rough ground. The crew also used a flying cam system, a miniature radio-controlled helicopter carrying a gyro-stabilized 35mm camera, to capture aerial shots that would have been extremely difficult for a conventional helicopter to achieve safely. The result is a sequence that feels almost impossible to control, and that was partially the point. What looks on screen like a perfectly choreographed military chase was actually built around real vehicles, real drivers, real mud, real crashes, and a huge amount of preparation. So while Die Another Day may be famous for its futuristic technology, the opening chase demonstrates something much more old school. Sometimes the best way to create spectacular action is simply to put real machines in a real environment and let the stunt team go to work. Later in the film, James Bond travels to the fictional Isla de los Oreganos in Cuba, where he tracks Zhao to a mysterious DNA replacement clinic. But once again, the movie wasn't actually a film where the story takes place. The exterior of the clinic was filmed at Castillo de San Sebastian, a historic fortress in Cadiz, Spain. The filmmakers used Cadiz to stand in for Havana and the fictional Cuban island, taking advantage of the city's architecture and coastline to create the illusion that Bond had traveled to Cuba. In fact, the production even altered the surroundings digitally, so the castle would appear to be sitting isolated on an island. In reality, the fortress is connected to the mainland by a walkway. But once Bond entered the clinic, the production moved indoors. The Dr. Alvarez consulting room and secret wing of the clinic were constructed at Pinewood Studios in England, allowing the filmmakers to control the environment for the complicated fight sequence between Bond and Zhao. Production records show that Pierce Brosnan and Ricky Yoon began shooting their clinic fight on February 6, 2002. This gave the stunt and camera teams much more freedom than they would have had inside the real fortress. Bond and Zhao go into the intense hand-to-hand fight, smashing through the clinic as the situation becomes increasingly chaotic. Eventually, Zhao tries to escape through a window and dives toward the water below. The important filmmaking trick here is that the production didn't have to risk smashing a performer through ordinary architectural glass. For shots requiring a person to break through a window, productions can use specially manufactured breakaway glass, commonly known as sugar glass, which is designed to shatter much more easily than normal glass. The actual filming of the clinic sequence was therefore a combination of a real Spanish fortress for the exterior geography and control studio sets at Pinewood for the dangerous interior action. And that's one of the things Die Another Day did particularly well. From a production standpoint, it could take a real location, combine it with a purpose-built set, add controlled stunt work and visual effects, and make it all look like one continuous place. The audience sees a mysterious Cuban clinic on an isolated island. Behind the scenes, however, Bond's journey to Cuba was actually assembled across Spain and England. One of the most visually spectacular sequences in Die Another Day is Bond's escape from Gustav Graves' enormous ice palace, followed by the Aston Martin Jaguar chase across Iceland. What looks like one giant frozen location was actually created through a combination of a massive practical set at Pinewood, real Icelandic landscapes, specially modified cars, stunt driving, and visual effects. The ice palace itself wasn't built inside a glacier. Production designer Peter Laminate created the enormous interior on Pinewood Studios' famous 007 stage. The set was roughly 3 stories high and 250 feet long, filling almost the entire soundstage. Its walls were made from translucent plastic rather than real ice, allowing cinematographer David Tattersall to illuminate the structure from the outside and create that cold, glowing blue appearance of an enormous ice fortress. But the filmmakers didn't stop at simply building a beautiful set. Director Lee Tamahori wanted Bond and Zhao's cars to continue their battle inside the ice palace. The Jaguar would chase Bond's Aston Martin up a huge 360-degree ramp and through curtains of melting ice water. To make this possible, the set had to be engineered for heavy stunt vehicles, while the action team spent about a month shooting the indoor car chase, and the melting ice wasn't just a visual effect. The production actually turned the 007 stage into a giant wet set, using high-pressure hoses to dump hundreds of gallons of water onto the set. The water created the illusion that Graves' ice palace was literally melting under the heat of the Icarus satellites. Crew members were even warned on the shooting schedule to bring suitable clothing because they were going to get soaked. But before Bond reached the ice palace, the production had to film the chase that begins outside on an actual frozen lake in Iceland. The location was Jökulsárlón, a glacial lagoon near Iceland's Vatnajökull region. The second unit, supervised by legendary stunt coordinator Vic Armstrong, spent weeks filming Bond's Aston Martin V12 Vanquish, battling Zhao's Jaguar XKR across the ice. The cars themselves had to be heavily modified because the standard Aston Martin and Jaguar weren't suitable for this kind of stunt driving. Special effects supervisor Chris Corbould rebuilt the stunt versions with 4-wheel drive systems. The Aston Martins were also fitted with special drivetrain modifications, ice-gripping tires, and emergency airbags in case a car broke through the ice. 4 stunt Astons and 4 stunt Jaguars were prepared specifically for the sequence. And the safety precautions didn't end with the cars. The frozen lagoon was around a foot thick, but the camera crew still didn't want to take chances. A lightweight ATV was specially built to carry the camera, and flotation devices were attached to it in case the ice gave way beneath the vehicle. The weather actually helped the production. The lagoon froze sufficiently to support the vehicles, giving the filmmakers a rare opportunity to shoot a high-speed car chase on a genuine frozen landscape. The extreme cold, however, created its own problems. Equipment and car components had to survive temperatures far below freezing. Then, after all that real Icelandic footage was captured, the production returned to Pinewood to continue the chase inside the enormous ice palace. So when Bond's Aston Martin slides through the melting ice palace, while Zhao's Jaguar comes after him, what you're watching is the result of real cars, real stunt drivers, a gigantic practical set, real Icelandic ice, and carefully controlled visual effects, all brought together to create one of the most ambitious car sequences of the Bond era. Right at the beginning of Die Another Day, James Bond and 2 other agents appear to surf enormous waves toward the North Korean coast. And unlike many of the film's later digital sequences, this footage was captured in the real ocean. The surfing was filmed at Pehahi, Maui, better known to surfers as Jaws, one of the world's most famous big wave breaks. The production waited for a suitable swell and filmed the surfers there in December 2001. The waves were enormous, more than 35 feet during some of the filming, and the conditions were dangerous enough that this was never something Pierce Brosnan could realistically perform himself. Instead, the production brought in 3 legendary big wave surfers, Laird Hamilton, Dave Kalama, and Derek Dorner. These were not ordinary stuntmen. They were pioneers of the emerging toe-in surfing technique, using personal watercraft to pull surfers into waves that were too large and too fast to catch by conventional paddling. The surfers were dressed to resemble Bond and the other agents, complete with black wetsuits, night vision goggles, and weapons as part of the disguise. Cameras positioned around Jaws captured them riding the enormous waves, while additional shore footage was filmed separately near Cadiz, in Spain, and Newquay, England. So although Pierce is the one we see on screen, those spectacular opening rides were actually performed by 3 of the most experienced big wave surfers in the world, putting real people into genuinely massive Hawaiian waves to create Bond's outrageous opening entrance. And then Die Another Day takes the surfing idea to a completely different level. Near the climax, Bond escapes the collapsing ice palace and suddenly finds himself riding an enormous wave generated by Gustav Gray's Icarus satellite. Unlike the opening surfing sequence, however, this one was not filmed in a real ocean. Brosnan's portions were shot against a blue screen, while the giant wave, glaciers, and surrounding environment were created digitally. This was one of the most technically ambitious effects sequences in the movie, and unfortunately for the filmmakers, it has also become one of the most heavily criticized examples of early 2000s CGI. For the live-action portions, Bronson had to perform inside a controlled studio environment, while the visual effects team planned to replace everything around him. The biggest challenge wasn't simply making a digital wave, it was making Pierce's movement, camera movement, and the computer-generated environment feel like they belonged together. So, unlike the opening Jaws sequence, which relied on real surfers riding real giant waves, Bond's final surfing escape was essentially a blue screen performance surrounded by computer-generated water and ice. During the climax, Gustav Grace turns the Icarus satellite toward the giant Antonov An-124 cargo aircraft, carrying out his operation. As the satellite's concentrated energy strikes the plane, the aircraft appears to burn and disintegrate in midair. And this sequence wasn't created entirely inside a computer. The production's miniature effects team actually built detailed scaled versions of the Antonov. Miniature effects craftsmen Nigel Blake and Bill Pearson worked on the film's miniature aircraft, alongside other large-scale miniature work for the movie. However, the final destruction wasn't simply a miniature being physically sliced apart piece by piece, as is sometimes claimed. The Antonov's exterior destruction also relied heavily on computer-generated effects, particularly the fire, energy effects, and additional destruction surrounding the aircraft. The filmmakers therefore combined miniature photography with digital effects to make the aircraft appear to be progressively consumed by Icarus's energy. That combination was especially useful because the miniature gave the camera a real physical aircraft with realistic lighting and reflections, while CGI could add the impossible elements, intense heat, glowing energy, fire, and the final breakup of the plane. And this was typical of Die Another Day. Even when the movie was using CGI heavily, the production still had a dedicated miniature unit, creating physical objects that could be photographed for the final composite. The Icarus satellite itself was another impressive example of the production combining miniature filmmaking with CGI. Instead of creating the entire satellite digitally, the miniature effects team built a detailed physical model of Icarus and photographed it for the orbital shots. According to production material, the model unit began shooting the Icarus sequences in late April 2002, with the satellite's main body represented by a physical miniature. But there was an important digital component. The satellite's enormous silver reflective panels were computer-generated. This allowed the filmmakers to create a scale and geometry that would have been extremely difficult to achieve with a practical model alone. The result was a hybrid effect. The physical miniature provided real lighting, reflections, and surface detail, while CGI expanded the satellite into the enormous orbital weapons seen in the finished movie. And that's what makes Die Another Day so interesting from a filmmaking perspective. If you enjoyed seeing how these scenes were actually made, leave a like and subscribe for more movie behind-the-scenes breakdowns. And let me know which movie you want to see next.